Lynn Hiles Ministries presents Dr. Lynn Hiles, that you might have life. And here's your host, Dr. Lynn Hiles.
Welcome back to the program again this week. I trust you've been following every one of these lessons that we've been teaching in this series, whether it is through our television outlets or through our YouTube channel. I trust that they are a blessing to you and you will be able to study them as you are able to go back to them and listen to them over and over again because of us being able to put it up on our YouTube channel, on our podcast, and on the RSS feed for your Android. And so that makes it available to you and to share with your friends. We encourage you to do that. I believe that the lessons that we will be sharing in the next several weeks will give people great peace as it relates to the beast of Revelation. We touched it some in earlier segments where we were talking about the dating of the book of Revelation. But we're going to go to the 13th chapter today, and we're going to talk about the land beast and the sea beast that rises from the sea. The unholy trinity, some call it, when you see the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet, the unholy trinity, where you see the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. In this segment, we are moving from not only the victory of Christ, but the victory of his church, as we dealt with the 12th chapter of Revelation last week when we talked about the woman and her seed. The battle is always for the seed, and it is both, I believe, interpreted in the historic context of both a natural battle, but also a spiritual battle. And we're going to try to kind of navigate that a little bit in this segment, because in the 12th chapter of Revelation, there was war in heaven. That signifies to me that there is a dimension of looking at it from what's happening in the heavens as compared to how it plays out in the earth and the planet, because the devil had been cast out in chapter 12 and now has come down to wreak havoc and chaos in the earth. And the dragon is the one who gives his power to this beast for a season. And we're going to show you some comparisons with that, and so much in this that we're going to try to deal with, but not be too exhaustive. I'm trying to make this series not be as long as the last one we did, but when you get into the book of Revelation, it's just so multifaceted and so connected with other scriptures, because it's really the summation and the conclusion of the whole redemptive program of God. And you have to be able to understand the other 65 books of the Bible, at least in some part, to be able to understand the imagery of the book of Revelation. In other words, if you see the imagery of a lamb in the book of Revelation, especially chapter 4, I saw a lamb as it were slain. Chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 6, I saw a lamb as if it had been slain. If you have not read the book of Exodus and understand the Passover and the sacrificial system, and did not know that that is iconic of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, then you couldn't interpret that correctly. You would think it's talking about a barnyard creature running around going, bah, And so when you use that hermeneutic, you kind of got to stay consistent with the imagery and see that God is drawing imagery from other places in the scriptures, that if you will read the Bible will interpret itself. This can't be said enough. If you compare spiritual things with USA Today or any other news outlet, and you try to make them fit the imagery of the book of Revelation, you're going to come up with all kinds of speculative ideas and failed prophecies. But when you compare spiritual things with spiritual things, in other words, you use the Bible to interpret the Bible, you will probably come up with a more consistent view. I saw someone post on social media this week that the view that we are teaching, the preterist view, is the one that's favored most among scholars. The dispensational futuristic future 7-year tribulation is most favored among charismatic Pentecostals. Now, while I am charismatic Pentecostal, I have really got into the Word and began to see things differently. And I really, when I started to discover these things, they came out of questions that would arise as I would listen to some of the other guys teach some of this. And once again, I'm not trying to be in contradiction to anybody, because some of the things that I share have come at great cost to me and my reputation and my ministry. But I prefer truth rather than the praises of men. And so, when I look at these things, and many of them I got just digging out and then finding other resources that would help me, I began to come to some conclusions that I knew would cost me greatly as far as friends and popularity and so on. But again, I embrace what I believe God's truth is more so than I value temporary relationships. And what I found is that sometimes it costs you relationships in one camp, but it opens doors for relationships in the other. So it is a journey that is ongoing, and I am a seeker and a searcher of truth, and I hope that you are too. And as we go through this, I am not dogmatic trying to tell you you've got to believe these things. As a matter of fact, some of this I tried not to see. I was in a conversation with a pastor this morning, and honestly, when I started to see some of this revelation, I was trying not to see it because I knew it was diametrically opposed to many of the things that I had been taught. But so I don't come at this as a dogmatic thing, but I simply a place to start to get you to open your mind to think in terms of how this would have applied to a first century church, especially since it's written to 7 churches that are in the book of Revelation. They are not 7 dispensations. That there's no biblical precedence to hang that on. There were 7 churches that were really in Asia that this was written to. When Paul wrote, for instance, even in the New Testament to the church at Ephesus, he's really writing to a church in Ephesus. It's written for us, but it's not written to us. In other words, when we read these letters, they were written to a certain group of people in a certain time slot. And if you put your mind in that first century and what they would have been thinking culturally and politically and spiritually, all of a sudden things begin to make sense. And then you start to compare that with the prophets and the things that were said earlier and see these as the fulfillment of those prophetic words. Then you can kind of really get clarity. So we're going to start in 13 today. It says, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the names of blasphemy. And the beast which I saw was like a leopard. His feet were as it were the feet of a bear. His mouth is the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority." I want to just note here that the authority and power to this beast is coming from the dragon. That ancient serpent is defined in the 12th chapter of Revelation when there was war in heaven and that serpent was cast out, knowing that he had but a short time and he would attack the remnant of her seed. Now, we're going to compare this in just a little while, but if you remember back when we were looking at the book of Daniel especially, that this beast was given authority to overcome the saints for times and a half times. It was given to him to do that, and we see that same thing being articulated in the 13th and 14th chapters of Revelation. Here is the same amount of time. And we're going to compare the beast of Revelation with the beast of the book of Daniel and show you there are absolutely remarkable and striking resemblances to this same beast that is clearly defined, especially when you read it from the Amplified Bible, that are defined as the kingdom of Rome. It's showing the digression of the kingdoms up until the Roman Empire. If you remember back when we were teaching some of this earlier, especially from Daniel chapter 2, the king had a dream, and he asked the soothsayers and all of those in the land to give him a description of what he saw. And Daniel, of course, you remember, comes back and he begins to describe to the king his dream and the interpretation. And he says to him, King of Babylon, you're the head of gold. After you is going to arise another kingdom. And if you read this in the Amplified Bible, it does the historic work for you. And it goes on to say that the second beast was the Medo-Persian kingdom under Darius the Mede. And you can see even biblical, what you see is that these are consistent things throughout the scriptures. Because if you go back to the book of Kings and the book of Chronicles, and then you can see where the first kingdom that carried them away into exile was the Babylonian kingdom. And then after them, the Persian king. And you see, of course, Ezra, Nehemiah, and some of these guys operating in the kingdom during the time of the Medo-Persian kingdom. And of course, Esther is during the Persian kingdom. After that, in Daniel chapter 2, the third kingdom that would arise on the earth would be the Greeks under Alexander the Great. And then the fourth kingdom on the earth would be Rome. It was part of iron and part of clay. And the great God had showed to Daniel what would come to pass in the end of days, as declared in Romans chapter 2. The end of that old covenant period is what he's talking about. Not the end of time, but the appointed time of the end. There's a great difference between the end of time and the appointed time of the end, as seen in Habakkuk, and also as seen in Revelation, the 11th chapter, when the mighty angel declared that there would be no more intervention of time, that there should be any more waiting or delay. The King James Bible says that there would be time no longer. It's really a bad translation. If you read another translation, it said that there would be no more intervention of time, that there should be any more waiting or delay. But in the days of the voice of the seventh angel, when he shall begin to sound, the mystery of God will be finished, as he's declared to his servants, the prophets. And the mystery of God was ending in the seventh trumpet, which is also the last trumpet. And we talked about that when we were in chapter 11, that the last trumpet sounded right after the siege of Jerusalem, or during that period of time that those trumpets are sounding, were during the last 3.5 years of the scope of Daniel's prophecy, and the last 3.5 years of the scope of the prophecy that Jesus gave when he said there would be tribulation such as was not since the world began or would ever be again. And so you see then this book is opening, and it's going to declare much of the same kinds of imagery here when you see this beast rise from the sea. And the sea beast is first. The beast which I saw was like a leopard. His feet is the feet of a bear, and his mouth is the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. And I saw one of his heads, as it were, wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed. And all the world wondered after the beast. And they worshiped the dragon, which gave power unto the beast. And they worshiped the beast, saying, Who is like unto the beast, and who is able to make war with him? And there was given him unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months. And he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle, and them that dwell in heaven. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints, and to overcome them. And power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of the life of the Lamb, slain from the foundation of the world. If any man have an ear, let him hear. He that leads into captivity shall go into captivity, and he that kills with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here's the patience and faith of the saints. And then we'll get into another beast that came up from the earth, the land beast, that had 2 horns like a lamb, but it talked like a dragon. We'll get into that a little bit later on. But let me go back and compare some of this with you. And we're going to go to Daniel, the book of Daniel, chapter number 7. And we're going to look at this again we're going to look at it in the Amplified Bible. And because it does the work for us, I think this is the right translation. Yeah. And Daniel chapter 7, let's look at the striking resemblances here. It says, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions appeared in his mind as he lay on his bed, and he wrote the dream down and related it, a summary of it. Daniel said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, the nations. You can see, hence, the beast is rising up from the sea, from the nations. Of course, we also know that Rome came from across the ocean, and they could see them as a sea beast. Now, it says in the great, and there's a whole lot of stuff that could be connected to this sea beast as well, because when you see the word abyss, or that came out of the bottomless pit, it is a word that's translated other places up out of the sea. And its first usage would be in Genesis 1, when the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the great deep. And the Spirit of God moved on the face of the great deep there, and the face of the water that God talked about is called the abyss. And so it's out of chaos, out of darkness, out of the power that you could see flowing from the dragon. And then, you could also see that in Deuteronomy, where talks about who will go across the sea, that is to bring the words of this law to us, that we may hear it and do it, is actually a word that is used by the Apostle Paul in Romans number 10. I'm getting way ahead of myself. But Paul said, who will go down into the deep? That is to bring up Christ from the dead. For the word of God is nigh thee, even in thy mouth. That is the word of the word of faith that we preach. If you look at that same verse in the book of Deuteronomy, it is they go across the sea to get the words of the law, that we may hear it and do it. And the word is nigh them, in their mouth and in their minds. In Deuteronomy, it is the words of the law. But in Romans, the 10th chapter, Christ is the end of the law. So he has went down into the abyss. He has defeated all the powers of darkness and taken the weapon of condemnation away from the enemy, and ascended with a dimension of salvation ready to be revealed in the last times, which was that if we believe in our heart and confess with our mouth the Lord Jesus, we will be saved, because he goes on to say the word of faith that we preach is with the heart man believes unto salvation, with the mouth confession is made. But he actually Paul quotes Deuteronomy, but replaces the word of the law with the word of Christ. For he said, who will ascend into the deep? That is to bring up Christ from the dead, or who will go across the sea, or who will ascend up into heaven. That is to bring the words of this law down to us, that we may hear it and do it, in Deuteronomy. But in Romans, he says, who will ascend up to heaven? That is to bring Christ down from above. But the fact that he was delivered for our offenses and raised for our justification tells me that everything that the law could demand has now been fulfilled in Christ, so that when you come to the 14th chapter of Revelation, there is a lamb standing on Mount Zion, and they have the seal of the living God in their foreheads. And Mount Zion there is speaking of the new covenant. Man, there's so much here, but I have to connect that to Hebrews, the 12th chapter, when he said, you did not come to blackness and darkness, you didn't come to fear and trembling. He's talking about Sinai. That's where the law was given, where Moses said, I exceedingly fear and quake. And but the next verse says, but you have come to Mount Zion, and you have come to the city of the living God, and you've come to the heavenly Jerusalem, and to a spirits of just men made perfect. In other words, the new covenant is Mount Zion, and it is the city of the living God, and it is an innumerable company angel, and it is the blood that speaks better things than Abel. So as we see, as you come on over even into the 15th chapter of Revelation, I saw as it were a sea of glass, and them that had gotten the victory over the beast, the number of his name, and they stood on the sea of glass, is that someone will come to a place, and it was a group of people, first of all in the first century, but has an ongoing results where we stand on the sea of glass having the victory over all the powers of darkness and over the powers of the enemy. So that is showing you the effect of the conquering of the Lamb. I saw on Mount Zion a Lamb, and with him 144,000 having their father's name written in their foreheads. Their father's name written in their foreheads is the contrast to the mark of the beast being written on the foreheads of those who worship the beast and his image. But as we see these beasts in the book of Daniel, and we're going to make a comparison with them, and maybe it might take more than one session to do this, but it says in the first year, again, of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions appeared in his mind as he lay on his bed, and he wrote the dream down and related the summary of it. Daniel said, I saw in night vision, behold, the four winds of the heavens were stirring up the great sea, the nations. And four great beasts, each different from the other, were coming up out of the sea in succession. The first is the Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar. The Amplified Bible actually does the homework for you here, does the historic background. The Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar was like a lion and had the wings of an eagle. I kept looking until its wings were plucked and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. A human mind was given to it. Behold, another beast, a second, the Medo-Persian Empire, was like a bear, and it was raised up on one side or domain, and 3 ribs were in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told, arise and devour much flesh. Let me see here. I lost my spot here. It's told to arise and devour much flesh. And it was told to arise and devour much meat. After this, I kept looking. Behold, another one. The Greek Empire of Alexander the Great was like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings like those of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads. Alexander's generals and his successors, and power to rule was given to them. After this, I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, I saw a 4th beast, the Roman Empire, terrible and extremely strong, and it had huge iron teeth. It devoured and crushed and trampled down what was left with its feast. It was different from all the beasts that came before it, and it had 10 horns. And you can see that in Daniel chapter 2 also, verses 40 through 43. And of course, chapter 7 here, and it also says it again in verse number 23. It says that it was different from all the beasts that came before it, had 10 horns. While I was considering the horns, behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one. And the 3 of the first horns were pulled up by the roots before it. And behold, in his horns were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth boasting of great things. And I kept looking until thrones were set up in the Ancient of Days. God took his seat. His garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was flames of fire, its wheels of burning fire. A river of fire was flowing and coming out from before him, and 1,000 thousands were attending him, and 10,000 times 10,000s were standing there before him. The court was seated, and the books were open. Remember, in the book of Revelation, all whose names were not written in the book of the life of the Lamb were worshiping the beast. Then I kept looking, and because of the sound of the great and boastful words which the horn was speaking, I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and given to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beast, their power was taken away, yet their lives were prolonged, for the length of their lives was fixed for a predetermined time. Now you will see that this beast that was speaking great things, its body was destroyed and given to be burned with fire. You come into the book of Revelation and you see the beast and the false prophet are cast into the lake of fire, which has so many implications that that's not the subject of this lesson. But suffice it to say that it really is dealing with the wrath of God being poured out upon this beast and this whole dimension of those who had given their power and strength to the dragon. Yet their lives were prolonged, for the length of their lives is fixed for a predetermined time. And I kept looking in the night visions. Behold, on the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him the Messiah was given dominion, supreme authority, glory, and a kingdom, that all nations, peoples, speakers of every language should serve and worship him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. As for me, Daniel, my spirit was distressed and anxious within me, and the visions that appeared in my mind kept alarming me and agitating me. And I approached one of those who stood by and began asking him the exact meaning of all this. So he told me and explained to me the interpretation of these things. These 4 great beasts are 4 kings who arise from the earth. But the saints, the believers of the Most High God, will receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever for all ages to come. Hence, that's why the 14th chapter of Revelation opens by saying, there were with him on Mount Zion 144,000 having their Father's name, because he's telling you that the ultimate victory belongs to the Lamb, it belongs to the Messiah, and to the saints of the Most High. And they will possess the kingdom forever and for all ages to come, according to the book of Daniel. Then I wish to know the exact meaning of the fourth beast, which was different from all the others, extremely dreadful, with teeth of iron and claws of bronze, which devoured, crushed, and trampled down what was left with its feet. And the meaning of the 10 horns, the kings that were on its head, and the other horn which came up later, and before which 3 of the horns fell, specifically that horn which had eyes and a mouth that boasted great things, and which looked larger than the others. And as I kept looking, that horn was making war with the saints, the believers, and overpowering them. And Daniel actually, or the translators actually put the text from Revelation 13, verses 7 through 9 in this text, because this is an exact fulfillment. I kept looking that horn was making war with the saints and overpowering them, because for Revelation 13, 7 through 9, that they would be given into his hand for a time, times and a half a time, until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was passed in favor of the saints of the Most High God. And at that time arrived, and the time arrived when the saints, the believers, took possession of the kingdom. Thus the angel of the fourth beast shall be the fourth kingdom on earth, which will be different from all other kingdoms, and will devour the whole earth and tread it down and crush it. As for the 10 horns out of his kingdom, 10 kings will arise, and another will arise after them, and he will be different from the former ones, and he will subdue 3 kings. He will speak words against the Most High and wear down the saints of the Most High, and he will intend to change times and laws and the law, and they will be given into his hand for a time, 2 times, and half a time, 3 1/2 years. But the court of the Most High will sit in judgment. His dominion will be taken away and to be consumed gradually, and then to be destroyed forever. Then the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven will be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all will obey him. This is the end of the matter. For me, Daniel, my thoughts troubled me. We're just about out of time. And so I want you to, follow us again as we come next week to continue on this. But if you would like to sow seed into this ministry, simply do it by going to our website and click on the link. There's a place where you can give through your credit card, debit card, through the PayPal portal, or you can send a check or money order to the address on the screen, or you can call the number on the screen. But do it today, because we need your help to stay on the air. God bless you.
For anyone struggling to understand John's writings in Revelation, this book provides true, biblically based answers. Through detailed insights into the letters John wrote to the 7 churches of his day, you will learn how to avoid the mistakes of the early church to overcome today's trials and tribulations. This book will provoke you to thought and dialogue, bringing greater clarity and revelation of Jesus Christ.